All right, folks, welcome to Barley Bin Live. Our next topic for the night is, I think, a fairly new one to barley, plant growth regulators. So chlormequat chloride, or Manipulator, as you may be more familiar with, was registered for use on barley in 2020, and then trinexapac-ethyl, or Moddus, the following year in 2021. So since then, a lot of the province has really been in a lot of moisture stress. Maybe not quite so much up in the northeast part of the province, but I think even 2021, between the combination of moisture and heat, it was probably a little too stressful for plant growth regulators when that products first came on the market. So I think probably northeast Saskatchewan, east central Saskatchewan, maybe north central. Those are prime target areas for plant growth regulator use in barley. It's high production areas, high rainfall, and I think it's going to be a spot where we start to see adoption of those tools to manage lodging in barley and even the height a little bit. So Chris at IHARF has been working with PGRs since the early 2010s, I think, in wheat, and then has rolled into it in the last few years in barley as well. So Chris has a lot of experience there. He's got a lot of experience in field research in general, been at it for 25 years. Between grad school and doing his work at IHARF and some stints at Ag Canada before that. So he's got a lot of experience and certainly a lot of expertise in the area. And so I encourage people to engage and ask Chris some questions as we get rolling. But I'll start with the ones that we posed to Chris. So as I mentioned, PGRs have only recently become options in barley. But you've had several barley projects at IHARF recently that have included PGRs. So up until 2024, what was your perspective on the benefits of PGR use in barley? And then 2024 has been a very different year. We had a lot more moisture, a little different kind of growing conditions. What's your perspective now? Has it changed? And I'll roll into number 2, and then you can go with your slides and let loose. So you led a project for SaskBarley. It was co-funded by Adopt with the Ministry of Agriculture. This project was initiated to compare crop safety and efficacy at reducing lodging. So how did the treatments look at IHARF in 2024? And if you can, comment on beyond the Indian Head location. So with that, we'll give it to you, Chris.
Perfect. Alrighty. So I guess we'll just kind of jump ahead here a little bit. I had just more or less repeated Mitchell's questions, but just to get us started, I think on that first one, which was coming up to 2024, what was my perspective? I am going to show you a fair bit of data, but some that I'm actually not going to present. We do a lot of industry work as well with IHARF, so I did actually have my hands on some of these products ahead of registration, and a little bit underwhelming. I think maybe 2017 we did some work with a range of rates with Manipulator on barley, and it was kind of when we first went from that stretch of wet years into not drought, but just a changing in the weather patterns going from 2016 to 2017. And with the Manipulator in some of that work, we really didn't see any impacts on either height or yield. And then we also did some work with Moddus leading up to, so probably a couple years ahead of registration there. And we did see some significant, not overwhelming, but significant height reductions, but basically very little lodging during that period and no real impacts on yield. So, they were working, but not necessarily putting dollars in your pocket at that point. Since that time, I guess we did roll into, in 2022 was when we first started what SaskBarley initiated. It was called the Enhanced Variety Trials. And the very first phase of that, we kind of had 3 separate sets of trials. One was looking at barley response to more intensive nitrogen fertility or enhanced nitrogen fertility. One was looking at responses to fungicide and kind of the disease packages. And then one, of course, was PGRs, where we did come in with a little bit higher fertility, only really focused on some of the wetter areas of the province and just really looked at some varietal differences in response to PGRs. So I actually don't know if I even have our list here of the varieties that we tested there. Oh, I do. We'll see them later. Yeah, I think I've got them in a couple slides. But 2022, for much of the province, including the areas that we were working with, Was another dry year. Some big yields, actually the best yields I've ever seen at Indian Head. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but still a drier year, not a lot of lodging. And this is kind of what we saw for some of the height reduction. So you can see kind of right across the board, Indian Head, Melfort, Outlook under irrigation, Prince Albert and Scott, where we ran the trials. Every one of those did see a reduction in height. And I should clarify here, we're also working with Moddus exclusively in this work. Everything until I get to the latter part, addressing question 2, will be Moddus. So some, I would say, small but significant reductions in height with the application of the PGR at all locations. This is averaged across all 6 varieties that we had that year. Very little lodging. We had 2 locations where we did have, I guess, some lodging. Indian Head was one. We were one of the wetter locations. It was actually above normal precipitation, but kind of a funny year. And the lodging was minor, but it was, you could kind of pick out those PGR treatments where it was just a little bit less of a lean or very little, where the stuff that didn't have a PGR wasn't difficult to combine, anything like that. But there was a little bit of lodging. Outlook under irrigation had quite a bit of lodging, that's a scale of 1 to 9. So, that would be noticeable. Maybe not too hard to pick up with the combine, but definitely some significant lodging there. And they virtually eliminated that with the application of the PGR. So again, fairly dry conditions here. This is looking at 2023. I just jump ahead. I'll show you yields in the next slide. So that was a drier year across the board. All of us were quite dry, lower yields. Some locations really didn't even respond with height. There was almost always a trend for height reductions, not always statistically significant, so take it for what you will. But if you look at kind of our first slide there, you can see that, we had, I think, 3 out of the 6 locations where we did this work, or who measured height, I should say, where we saw a significant height reduction. So 50% of the sites. Prince Albert missed that measurement. Flip over to the next one. That's actually looking at lodging there, and all of the sites except Prince Albert didn't see even a hint of lodging. I mean, that was a year, it was just dry. All of our cereals were standing up straight as an arrow. Nice combining. You could travel pretty fast. Prince Albert was kind of a funny one. If we looked at the project as a whole, their measurements were pretty variable. Our experiment was a little bit different here. We had the fungicide treatments, the enhanced fertility, and the PGR with 4 varieties kind of all in one. And there tended to be just a lot of spatial variability, I guess environmental impacts. So statistically, it wasn't significant, but I mean, I think when we isolate those treatments, I can look at that and be pretty confident that we are reducing lodging at Prince Albert under those conditions. It's a shame they didn't get the height, but ultimately, lodging is kind of what we're primarily trying to address with these tools. Here's some of our varietal effects, I guess, and this is kind of interesting, and actually I'll show you the next slide, but we see this in both years. So Connect, Synergy, Austenson, Fraser, Claymore, and Oriana were the ones that we were working with, but we did have an interaction there where basically Oriana, we were not reducing height significantly. There was a trend, all of the other ones, it's not dramatic, but it did pop out as significant. This is averaged across all of the different locations, just looking at the varieties. So that was kind of our interaction there, where basically the first 5 varieties we worked with, we did have that significant reduction. Oriana was shorter and stood up pretty good, I guess, regardless, but we didn't see that impact. Here's 2023. It's a little bit of a busier slide because I really, I guess, wanted to show some of the nuances of all of the treatments that we looked at here. So we have, I'll just maybe go through the treatments very quickly, but those red bars is just kind of our standard package. So not a neglected crop, but it didn't have a fungicide. It had, a more conservative nitrogen rate, no PGR applied, and I think that would be the gist of it. That was kind of, so lower end, no fungicide, no PGR. The green bars are where we gave it that extra nitrogen. So that did tend to get a little bit more height out of that crop, a little more yield potential. The blue ones is what we're interested in here. That's our PGR. And then the fungicide, we wouldn't really expect to impact height, but the yellow bars actually don't have a fungicide. Everything else was sprayed with a fungicide because we didn't want disease to be limiting where we were testing the PGRs and the enhanced fertility. But, I guess if we wanted to distill this, same kind of thing here where we see a similar response on our first 5 varieties that we worked with. But again, Oriana really didn't respond to the PGR or any of the other treatments when it came to plant height. here's our yield, I guess, both kind of lumped into one slide over the 2-year period. So all in all, I guess I would say, and yield isn't everything when it comes to PGRs. There's other things that have value, but under the conditions that we saw in those years, pretty underwhelming. Most of us didn't have a lot of lodging to begin with. At Prince Albert there, that first year where we did see some lodging, we do see a little bit of a pop for yield. It wasn't quite statistically significant where we wanted to. I think in our report it's flagged as not significant, but when I look at the p-values, it was like 0.7 or something. So that means we're kind of 92% confident that there's something going on there, which I think that's good enough for me and this crowd in general. A lot of times we don't need to be quite that level of rigor, but for the most part, lodging wasn't a limiting factor, and you can see that we weren't gaining any extra yield with those PGRs. That's where I was getting ahead of myself before. I had to do my math multiple times from the combine in Indian Head that year. That's the best barley I've ever grown that year. We were, pushing 140 bushels an acre averaged across the varieties there. 2023, even drier conditions and really no significant yield responses, except for, unusually, was swift current. Very low yield. I mean, it's a borderline crop failure. I can't really explain this. The best thing I can come up with is that maybe with the PGR, a little bit less vegetative growth, a little bit less height, maybe it just hung on to some of that moisture to help with grain filling and gave us a little bit yield in the end. At the end of the day, I mean, if those are your yields, you're not real happy with your crop either way, I guess. But that was the one site that was responsive. Maybe I'm spoiled in Indian Head, and we have more common with you folks up here in Indian Head than they would at Swift Current. But it's a tough site for some cases. So how did that change, I guess, in 2024? I don't have a lot of yield data here just yet, but I will show you some yield with the next project that I think can give us some good insights into what we might expect for this one. But we did carry on with our enhanced variety trials at all sites again in this past year. We changed them up a little bit where we, I guess, dropped it down to, I want to say 4 varieties from 6, and then still had kind of all of the different management practices really looked in there, but just a little bit of a smaller trial in terms of the number of varieties. The other thing that we did is we completely renewed the list of varieties that we were working with. I guess talking with Mitchell, we kind of felt that we had a decent handle, even though every year is a little bit different on kind of how things were performing with the first set of varieties that we worked with. So we just wanted to renew that list. But like Mitchell said, it was a very different year. I'm going to really, for this first kind of set of trials, focus more just on kind of what I saw at Indian Head. But what I can tell you about our site is we started out the year extremely dry. Actually, in April, when I first got out flagging plots, the ground was powder. I was worried about even being able to soil sample and thinking, this is not looking good. But by the time the summer students all came and I wanted to get into the field and keep them busy, it started raining and it wouldn't stop. Pretty much at that point. So conditions did certainly improve. We had a lot of rain in May. We still got our crops in good time. Cool season. June stayed cool. A lot of rain in June as well. So lots of really lush vegetative growth. Then at that point, I think like many in the province, July came along and things did get really hot. The rain virtually stopped for us at that point. So, we certainly lost some yield potential, but we are in a heavy clay soil. We had all that vegetative growth there, and so still some pretty nice crops. I can comment just on experience. Things were lighter for the most part. Just our bushel weights in a lot of the cereals, and yield potential wasn't what we maybe would have expected to see looking at that crop in June and the first 2 weeks of July. I know I was bragging up our crops pretty good at the field day, and then it kind of got a little bit quiet after that, but I still, the way it finished at Indian Head, I certainly wouldn't get on social media and start complaining, because a lot of areas where you're on coarser soils certainly suffered a lot more, and we did okay. But that's just a little bit of a visual of some plots. And Mitchell actually made a trip out to the site he had to walk out to the field, unfortunately, because it just wouldn't stop raining at that point, but just wanted to see some of the treatment effects that we were having there. So I think that might actually be synergy there in probably the absence of any PGR, of course, and possibly some extra fertility. I can't remember for sure which trial that was. But how did that change? So let's just look at some of our results here. So here's really, I'm just going to show you Indian Head, but this is kind of, things will be coming together over the next month or two, and we'll see a little bit more. But this is our height data. So our varieties, I guess, just to back up a little bit, we were working with AAC Prairie, CDC Churchill, one of Aaron's there, I think, was that one that you mentioned? Yeah. Durango, another one, and AB Wrangler, and then that's our overall average. But across the board, not a tremendously, fairly tall crop, I guess, probably pretty close to average, but every one of those did respond in terms of height, and we did see that height reduction with the application of Moddus, full rate of Moddus there, and no interaction with variety, which is basically telling us that the PGR effect, actually the management effects, this trial was bigger than just PGRs, was consistent across varieties. I'm isolating PGRs here, and actually these p-values will reflect that because I really just was kind of interested in comparing for this variety with and without PGR. So that gives us a little more strength, I guess, when it comes to saying whether or not that technology had an impact. But we can see that it did for every single one of those. Here's when we look at lodging, and things do get pretty interesting here. Our crop first started going down, it was right at the end of July probably, and honestly I didn't even realize it rained. It didn't rain in town. I got out to the site and the ground was just marginally wet, barely even enough to pick up on your boots, but all of a sudden we pulled up to the Barley and there were just individual kind of treatments here and there that were starting to go down. Check the weather, and sure enough we did have a little storm roll through, which I think we maybe got it was maybe a tenth, something like that, not a lot of rain. But it was bone dry going into that, and it came with some high winds, and so you could hardly even tell that it rained, but just the crops were telling us, and that was kind of when you looked, and it really just kind of carried on from there. That was end of July. Once we got into about, through much of August, as we were just trying to kind of get the combine rolling, it seemed like we were getting thunderstorms every night at that point, and 70, 80K winds. We had some days where winds were up over 100, and it just wouldn't stop raining. I did have challenges getting out some of these crops that did go down a little bit more. I just couldn't get the darn things combined. Lentils, for example, were flat and the ground was just too wet to get them. Barley, I kind of struggled the same way because some of that was going down, that the undergrowth just wasn't drying out, and it was really hard to pick up. I actually combined flax, interesting side note, before either lentils or barley this past year, which that's a first. But coming back to our lodging, I guess we can see that a couple here really stood out kind of right out of the gate. Prairie and Durango really hadn't lodged at all, and the PGR didn't have any impact there. I think in our seed guide, I do have some notes here, but I think actually Churchill might be better than Prairie, I think, in the seed guide for lodging, but we did see that that didn't quite materialize at Indian Head, and I think that's just kind of normal variation that we can sometimes see the way things hit the stages that they're at. But for both Wrangler and Churchill, we did have significantly more lodging, pretty much eliminated again with the PGR. So they really work quite well. There was something else I thought I wanted to say about that. Yes. So these ratings were done probably close to 2 weeks before I combined, and things would have progressed a little bit farther between there and combining. In a perfect world, I maybe would have gone out and actually just rated everything again, but we were trying to progress with harvest like everyone else and didn't get to that. But I think the patterns would have been pretty consistent. And this was, already a basically good 2 weeks of some pretty significant weather and lots of pressure for lodging. But we do see management affecting lodging, PGR affecting lodging, and that significant interaction. What was really interesting to me this year was just how much negative impact with respect to lodging in particular that extra nitrogen could have. So it really kind of, I think encouraged us to maybe dial in those N rates a little bit closer. We've gotten away with some pretty high rates, I don't think, with yield potential, but moisture coming at the right time. We haven't been getting the lodging. We've had, still good yields for the most part, so protein hasn't necessarily been a big issue, and we've maybe been creeping up with our N fertility. But where we gave an extra 30 pounds of nitrogen here, it really made a difference when it came to how that crop stood up. So just a note on fertility here, we were adjusting for soil nitrogen, and our standard rate was soil nitrogen plus fertilizer was 120 pounds, so still a pretty good rate. And then we tacked on another 30 pounds for that enhanced N fertility. But that just goes to show, so this is our control, no PGR. Same thing, no PGR, but just that extra 30 pounds of nitrogen, how much more lodging that caused. So that was interesting. I know I'm here to talk about PGRs, but I do think that's relevant to the topic for sure. And this is just kind of taking a step back and looking at all those treatments together. So you can see our red bars are our standard management. Blue is the fertility. Green is kind of standard management. So it's not getting a PGR. It is getting a fungicide, but it's getting that extra 30 pounds of nitrogen. And really, really kind of jumped out at us. And Churchill and Wrangler were, of the bunch, kind of the worst there, where Durango and Prairie, for the most part, stood up quite well throughout it. Actually, no statistically significant differences across our management treatments for those varieties. So, I don't know how I'm doing for time. Am I going too slow, too fast, just right? I've got a little bit to get through here. I'm not even looking at my clock, but I tend to be long-winded and always have too much data for the amount of time I'm allotted, but we'll do our best. You guys can tell me to hurry up if I need to, but how did the treatments look on our new PGR mixing project at Indian Head in particular, and can I comment on some other sites? So we'll go into that. This was a really, to me, quite an exciting project, and we had a good year for it as well, which was, we kind of lucked out there because, you never really know what you're going to get when you come up with these protocols 5 months ahead of planting time and then 3 months of growing season. But really, we wanted to look at the responses of three either currently adopted or up-and-coming malting varieties to some of the PGR options that are available. So either Manipulator, chlormequat chloride, it'll be abbreviated as CC, or Moddus. Oh, I've got and there. I'll have to correct that there for my presentation next week. Moddus, which is trinexapac-ethyl, so abbreviated as TE. Applied both alone, or what was unique here is we also looked at them in combination. So in combination, I'll just show you my treatments. I think that's the easiest. So our locations, we did try to focus on some of the wetter ones: Indian Head, Prince Albert, Scott, and Outlook. And then our treatments, we had 7 different PGR treatments. So of course we've got our untreated control here. And then if we, flip back up to the top, we've got a full rate of Moddus, misspelled I see, lots of little errors I'm finding. Full rate of Manipulator, half rate each of Moddus and Manipulator. So not really one that we're, specifically thinking that people would be using, but we just kind of wanted to balance out our treatments. And then we get into our tank mixes. So we either took, this is probably the most practical of the bunch, where we just take a half rate of each of those 2 active ingredients and apply it both in the same sprayer tank at the same time, of course. And then here's where we really get wild and basically take a full rate of each product, throw it into the sprayer and apply those together. Something that probably gets a little bit expensive. I think we're up over $30 an acre plus your application costs. Pretty potential to be pretty hot. So not something I would, for the faint of heart, or that I would really recommend, but it's interesting. Our varieties were Synergy, which I think is probably the #1 variety here right now, and then some up-and-comers here, Fraser and Connect. And I don't have too much, I don't think, experience with Fraser prior to this year here, but have been growing Connect in some other trials for quite a few years. Data collection, emergence, just to kind of get a handle. We just did our control. We did phyto ratings. We thought this was important. I don't present it because we didn't actually see a lot of phyto. I do have that. It will be in the reports, don't worry, but I don't bring it up today. But honestly, there was really nothing to be concerned about anyways. I know when I rated our plots at Indian Head, I could see just some very minor just spots, almost like a little bit of surfactant burn, but it was so minor. I think on a scale of 1 to 5, I had a few plots that might have been hitting 0.5. It wasn't anything to be concerned about. When I did apply our treatments at Indian Head was kind of interesting conditions. I got mixed up one day, ready to go. It was raining all the time. This was in June. And the wind got up, so we couldn't spray. So I talked to actually some of the reps, said, can I leave these chemicals in my bottles, mixed up, ready to go, get out either tonight or tomorrow morning? And actually it was the fellow from Belgium I talked to said if you apply that to wet plants, that you might see more burn. So I thought, well, I'll do what I can, but we're rating things anyways, so we'll just go for it. It started drizzling that night. The wind eventually went down, but then it was spitting that night. And so we got out there at 5:30 the next morning, and were some very wet plants, but it was progressively getting drier. And that's when we put on our treatments, because the wind was supposed to get wild that day again too, and we had to do this. But so that was just kind of the condition. So probably pretty good conditions to maybe see some phyto. Plant height, of course, we're going to do. Lodging, that's a no-brainer. Yield, and then some quality measurements. And we did all of our quality in-house and are basically looking at test weight, TKW, percent plumps, and protein. So I will start with Indian Head here. I do have data from Scott as well that I'm going to show you. So here's plant height. Again, I don't show the phyto, but even under those conditions, there was really nothing to be concerned about visually anyways that we could see. We'll look at the quality that we have anyways, and that might tell a different story, but in terms of leaf spotting, not a lot. Here is our overall, I guess, averaged across varieties effects on plant height here. So here's our control, is the orange bars here. That's our tallest. And right off the bat, I guess the only thing that didn't reduce height was that half rate of Manipulator. That didn't, it kind of trended down a little bit, but not statistically, and you'd really never see it. Full rate of Moddus worked pretty good. Full rate of Manipulator actually worked pretty good for height, and not quite as good as Moddus, but they're in the same ballpark. Our tank mix here of the half rate of each was numerically a little bit better than Moddus, but basically the same thing when we take a little bit of variability into account. This 1X tank mix, anyone who was at our field day, that really jumped out at you, and we could see those ones from a mile away. Those were noticeably shorter, and it really shortened up those plants. So that's looking at our height. If we just kind of look at the stats here, not to get too bogged down, variety by PGR interactions were not significant, which is telling us that basically that response was pretty consistent across the varieties that we were working with. So here's looking at lodging. As we know, we had a lot of lodging. Synergy stood out, not stood up so much, and not necessarily in a good way. Nice variety, but it was the one that went down on us by far more than any of the others. Both Fraser and Connect were pretty comparable to one another. When we look at our PGR treatments, over here is our untreated control. On a scale of 1 to 9 we're looking at there, I was coming in at basically, this is averaged across varieties like 4.5. So, if I isolated Synergy there, it was probably more up. Like I had some plots that was rating like 7 or 8 out of 9. They were pretty much flat, like some of the pictures that we saw there. I guess our half rate of Manipulator didn't help at all. Our full rate of Manipulator, numerically a little bit better, so maybe a little bit of improvement, but certainly not across all plots, not statistically significant, so that didn't work as well as we would have liked. Full rate of Moddus, that was a winner right there. That worked pretty well for us. So, that alone is about as good as we're going to get. Half rate of Moddus, not statistically different, numerically a little bit. We'll see if maybe anything comes out of that as we get more data, a little bit more experience under our belt. But even that seemed to actually help quite a bit with the lodging. And our tank mixes, not significantly different. None of these were significantly different, but even just kind of talking to Mitchell, it really looked like that 1X mix was almost bulletproof there, that thing couldn't go down. Variety by PGR effects on lodging. So yeah, we do have a significant interaction here. To me, the interaction isn't all that interesting because for the most part, our patterns are quite similar across the board. I think it's really just coming from some of these varieties that we didn't have that same level of lodging pressure. Both Fraser and Connect, maybe Connect to a little greater extent than Fraser. It didn't necessarily matter even without the PGRs. We didn't have a lot of lodging. But the patterns were really quite similar across the board, but just everything was really jumped out, more separation with Synergy, so that's kind of where that interaction's coming from. Here's our grain yield results. So prior to this year, things have been pretty underwhelming with respect to grain yield and PGRs on barley. This still isn't anything so dramatic, but it's certainly significant and nothing to shrug off, I guess. I think we're at about a 10% yield advantage to that full rate of Moddus over our untreated control, which is, definitely more than enough to pay for that cost of application. We've got a few others that don't differ from that. Our half rate of trinexapac still yielded quite well, not quite where we wanted to be or where we were with the full rate. That half rate tank mix looked pretty good. Everything else was a B. So Manipulator, full or half rate, didn't differ from the control for yields. That 1X tank mix, even though you couldn't knock that crop down, it I think was just starting to have some negative impact. It's just something we can see with PGRs, not often. These are pretty safe, but it's not unheard of. Test weight, this is just hot off the press, but we do, for the most part, not see a heck of a lot there. None of them actually significantly differed from the control. But with that full rate of trinexapac, we actually do have the highest test rate of the bunch. And I suspect that's probably that it was quite safe under the conditions encounter and then also didn't lodge. So even that early lodging in July might have had some negative impact on test weight, I'm thinking. Probably where that comes from. We do have an interaction, and I haven't really had a lot of time to kind of digest this. I really just got it, but for the most part, our patterns are similar. I might have had some notes here. Maybe just that Connect was less sensitive to Manipulator and perhaps more sensitive to the tank mixes is what we're seeing here. That's, I suppose, one thing that does jump out. Even that half-rate tank mix, we are losing some test weight with that tank mix. Where everything else is pretty much the same as the control. So not a lot for downside. We do see some where maybe looks like that Manipulator could have had some negative impact on test weight. Generally not significantly different from the control, but that 1x rate of Moddus is kind of consistently up amongst the top and not causing us any harm, which is good news under the conditions where we're really supposed to be using these products and seeing some benefits. Protein, nothing. A little bit of varietal differences there, but none of the products affected protein. The only thing I really ever worry about with protein, for the most part with PGRs in barley, if you're in an environment that needs a PGR, I wouldn't be worried about it at all, because with malt, we do want that lower protein. What we'll sometimes see with PGRs is if we get a big yield bump, we can lose a little bit of protein. So that's kind of something that people have always wanted to manage with wheat. Barley, I would see it as a positive, particularly with malt, if it is going to happen. Where I would have been most concerned, and we see some tendencies, is maybe where we were potentially having some negative impact on yield. You might see protein jump a little bit, but can't say we really saw that at Indian Head. Now let's move on to Scott. So a little bit of a different environment. They just didn't have the lodging, basically. I think it was still a pretty good production year for the most part at Scott. Pretty similar weather patterns to what we had at Indian Head, but they just didn't maybe have quite as much vegetative growth early on and maybe didn't catch some of the rains. Our problem at Indian Head was twofold. Number one, in May and June, we had all that rain, cool conditions, just so much vegetative growth there, which in itself was maybe, setting us up for that risk of lodging. But what really did it was the wind and the rain that we got in August and the very end of July. It just, if we didn't get some of that weather, it probably would have stood quite well. But it just, really took a pounding kind of that first couple of weeks of August when it was raining every night. Height responses, for the most part, they're quite similar to Indian Head, with the exception of they really didn't even see any height reduction with Manipulator. So it just wasn't working as well at Scott. Their 1x rate of Moddus were quite good. Not quite as good with the half rate. Still better than Manipulator, whether a full rate or half. Tank mixes looked good. That 1x rate was, again, standing out as the shortest of the bunch. And that half rate, pretty similar, just to a full rate of Moddus. Not necessarily any better. Actually, a little bit worse, but statistically the same. Variety by PGR tells us that no interaction there. Tells us that the PGR effect on height at Scott was consistent across varieties. Looking at lodging, they had a little bit. They had some treatment effects. Certainly not the extent of lodging that we saw at Indian Head, though. So, here on the scale of 9, we don't have anything that hits a 2. And I'm calling a 2 usually, is just kind of that crop that, it's got a good lean. Maybe you can't look right down between individual rows, right? But it's not causing you any trouble with harvesting. It's standing pretty well overall. So they do have some differences there. Again, that full rate of Moddus is doing the job. No real advantage to the mixes over that full rate of Moddus. And they're not getting really that great a protection against lodging with the Manipulator. Barley yields, really nothing was better than the control. Numerically, their control was the best. For the most part, we didn't see a lot of harm with the PGRs, which I think is a win overall. And I have had farmers tell me that, even if I don't get a yield gain, if I can maybe combine that crop earlier or move the machines through the field quicker, that's still, it's maybe not perfect, but it's still got some value and going to make me at least consider a PGR. They didn't have a lot of lodging. I wouldn't be concerned about it. And for the most part, we see a whole lot of A's there. The only exception is our full rate tank mix, where we got that full rate of each product, is actually causing some significant yield reduction there, which just brings us back to that maybe being a little bit little bit too hot, especially if you're under, some potentially more drought risk kind of environments. If you've got all the moisture in the world, probably not going to hurt you, but it's getting riskier. Barley test weight, no significant differences there. We see a little bit of up and down where maybe, some treatments are having some negative impacts, but variability was pretty high at this site with their test weights for some reason as well too. So none of that actually popped out as being significant. Seed weights, I've got all the quality data from Scott. No impacts. We've got some variety differences, which isn't really what we're here for, but the PGRs weren't having any impact on seed weight. This is what they did impact though, and that was our percent plump kernels. So I think that's interesting, something to take note of, but really the only one that was hurting us to a significant extent was where we went in with that full rate of both products. We do see maybe some very small drops there, but nothing statistically significant, so we can't necessarily say that that's specifically due to the treatments, and really not with the level of variability we saw, no real evidence that that's the case. But with our full rate tank mix, we certainly do. Barley protein, even though we saw some yield loss, I guess, with the one site, that full rate tank mix numerically hits the highest, but it didn't really get us into any trouble relative to any of the other treatments when it came to protein. And I think that is all I have for data. So I'm not sure if I used up more time than I was supposed to, but hopefully if there's any kind of questions or, people can always feel free to reach out to me as well. My contact info is there, but anybody use some PGRs this year? Anybody struggle with lodging in their cereals this year? Yeah, it seemed to certainly be a hot topic. I did the coffee shop talks for Sask Wheat there earlier in December, and that's what they specifically wanted me to come talk about. I was up north of Saskatoon for that, and we'll be kind of giving a broader discussion, I guess, on PGRs, on cereals next week at the agronomy research update too. So it's been something that we've, I think really fought with kind of when I go back to when we first got PGRs, just to take you on a little bit of a history, I guess. My experience with it, 2012 is when we first got it, and that was when, at the time, Engage Agro first got a hold of chlormequat chloride in the current formulation that is Manipulator, and we were doing some other work for them. We were actually spraying pod sealants on wheat to reduce pre-harvest sprouting, so I don't know if that's something that didn't work, but we didn't really have the conditions for it. But they got this other product that they were kind of excited about, and they were like, can you use this? And I was like, well, we don't work for free, you got to pay us, but if you if you want, you can give me a little bottle and I can just spray half of your trial that we've already got in place there. So that's what I did, and that was 2012. We had Unity wheat, really bad year for disease, lodging, all that, and it really set the bar high. Like I think we had about a 15 or a 20 centimeter reduction in height on that wheat, and our yields were like 50% higher. It was wild. We lost 1.5 percentage points. But then from that point, we did a lot of work really just trying to dial in that label with Engage Agro at the time, now Belcham. And so we were looking at timings of application, different rates of application, variety profiling, all that. And then it's just kind of more recently, like Mitchell said, where we move things into barley and to a lesser extent oats. We're doing a little bit of work with oats as well. I would say oats, if you're oat growers, which you probably are up here, will behave pretty similar to barley for the most part, where Moddus tends to be the stronger active ingredient and maybe not as responsive as wheat under most circumstances. Haven't seen some of the negatives. I do have an interesting story with oats though. I think it was 2018, we had Arborg oats, pretty dry year, and we had a trial similar to what we just did here with all those different tank mixes. And when I took Arborg oats in a dry year and hit them with a full rate of both Manipulator and Moddus, the plants were shorter than the canola stubble I direct seeded them into, and it was crazy. I was 3/4 of the way through a plot before I had enough material for the reel to scoop it up and bring it into the combine, and we did see some negative impact on yield and quality there as well too. And then the last few years, just with things being drier, lodging being less of an issue, I really do think we got to give some credit to the breeders. Our varieties have gotten better, and we do see, sometimes still these yield pops in the absence of lodging or with relatively light lodging, but they're not as consistent. They tend to be smaller in magnitude, and you certainly don't have the harvest inefficiencies that we can with a crop that really grows down. So I think as you I won't rule out that you couldn't see a benefit to a PGR in a really good variety that's probably not going to lodge, but the likelihood and the magnitude of that benefit are more than likely going to be less. So we're pretty tight on growth stage in terms of our application, and yeah, everything was pretty close. We were targeting 30 to 32 here, so really just kind of pseudo stem elongation, and no, none of the varieties stood out as kind of maybe being identified as needing a separate application date. Is that kind of what you mean, or yeah. To maybe explain some differences across varieties, things like that. Yeah. The question is do we see maybe more of a consistent yield bump with wheat than with barley? I would say anecdotally, yes. Unfortunately, I can't really separate crop type from some of the environmental conditions that we've had. So a lot of my experience with wheat, 2012 through 17, 18, 17 things were tapering off, but we were getting some really good responses, but that was just through a wet cycle where we had a lot of lodging, maybe older varieties. We are doing some work with variety profiling and Moddus versus Manipulator with wheat here right now too, and I can't say that we're seeing a tremendous amount of benefit. This year here, we had more lodging. I do have some significant yield benefits just this past year at Indian Head. I wouldn't say better than what we got with barley. If anything, maybe not quite as strong. It's a little bit, some nuances there with our plot layout, split plot versus randomized kind of design. So I don't know if I have the statistical strength to pick them up, but hard to say. One thing I will say with wheat is that anecdotally, to a large extent, because we just haven't had the pressure, I would say we probably see more consistent responses to Manipulator as opposed to Moddus with wheat. So that's just kind of where my gut would, and if it was me paying the bills and growing the crops, I would probably lean that direction for a product. Where barley and oats, it's the other way, where I probably would really choose Moddus as my product of choice. But no, these last couple of years with wheat have been pretty Moddus, or pretty pretty modest, I guess, what we've been seeing for responses there. Last year, under quite dry conditions, but still good yields. I think I had wheat kind of hovering in that 70 to 80 bushel an acre. I was about I think on average a 6 or 7% yield benefit with Manipulator in particular on wheat. Not quite there with the Moddus. And so it definitely paid for the cost of application. It actually made us a little bit of money, but not like some of the results we've seen in previous years. And in some of those years with barley at our site, we really didn't see much benefit. So maybe, I guess, if in that respect, yeah, maybe sometimes a little bit better than wheat, but this year I wouldn't really say that. I'll have to look at a little bit closer at the wheat data, but I think it was probably pretty comparable to what we saw with the barley here. This year we certainly had worse lodging with the barley than we did with any of the wheat varieties we were growing. And it wasn't all varieties, but the ones that went down, especially when we had that extra nitrogen, it would have almost been nice, but of course funds are finite. But to pair it up with that higher fertility. And I should mention that in this latter trial here, where we do the PGR mixing, we really threw the nitrogen to it there. I think I was, with soil land, which I only had about 11 or 12 pounds, I think we were like 175 pounds or something. So we really threw the nitrogen at it there to induce some lodging. So, maybe a lot of farmers wouldn't have had quite that dramatic of lodging that what we saw. And it's also why our protein was, I think we were like averaging about 15% there. I questioned our tech when I first started. Our one replicate was a little bit lower yielding. When I first just kind of pulled up the data sheet after he sent it to me, my proteins were up in 16%, and I called him up and I said, you're using the wrong calibration on the NIR. There's no way our protein's that high. But then I kind of looked, and where we had the higher yields, it did come down to still not where you would want it to be for malting. And no, he did. He certainly was using the right curve. And then I looked back at my notes and like, oh yeah, we also gave it 160 pounds of nitrogen. So, yeah, is marketability going to be any better or worse with PGRs? And I think it's certainly something you need to be careful of. Mitchell might be better to comment on this, but my understanding, I think, is that Manipulator in particular is flagged as a kind of on the keep it clean list for malting barley. With oats, I don't think you really want to check with whoever you're selling the grain to. I think a lot of the milling companies are probably going to be pretty apprehensive there. So if it's feed, no problem. The good news is that I don't think there's any such restrictions with Moddus for either malt or feed, and that is the product that, without hesitation, I would I would recommend as well on your barley. So it never hurts to ask, you know, whoever you're selling your grain to. I think it's something you want to keep up with before you go out and make that application. The other good thing about PGRs too, you know, even with some fungicides, and Kelly certainly knows this, like sometimes it's really hard to know what your risk of is going to be at the time when you have to make that decision to do an application. Where with PGRs, I think it's a little bit easier anyways. You know, if you've got that lush growth, like we're on 12-inch spacing, if it's June 10th and I can't see in between rows and there's lots of soil moisture, you know, I know that there's pretty good potential for lodging to be an issue. It's not a guarantee, but so, you know, it's something that you can, I think, make a fairly educated decision on when the time comes to put it on, which is nice. We don't always have that luxury with our inputs where it's kind of more insurance, but here it's still insurance. It's crop protection, not necessarily yield building. But I do think that if you go out there and you just, you know, you don't have that lush crop, your rows aren't necessarily filling in that thick, it's dry, there's no rain in the forecast, for the most part, you can probably save your money. Not to say that you might not see a small yield benefit, but some years, which we never had the trials in place, so I can't really comment, but I think when Manipulator first hit the market, like 2021, would have been when it was kind of first, 2020? Yeah, when that was kind of first widely available, a lot of guys gave it a try. Probably didn't need it, but they were excited to have this new product in the shed, and it caused some problems. Yeah, we're just, you know, heads weren't coming out of the boot and causing some yield loss. So, which was a bit of a tough launch, I guess, you know, coming out of some wet years. But hopefully that turns around and we get into a cycle where we see some rains on a regular basis. In your opinion, where is the best barley growing area in Saskatchewan? I don't know, right here. No, I honestly don't know. I'm biased. I find at Indian Head, we are pretty consistent. It's well-drained land, but nice heavy soil. Usually not too wet, not too dry. You know, no salinity, things like that. But yeah, I don't know. That's a tough question for me to ask. Anywhere, I think, where you kind of can have that consistent yield potential and it's a little bit easier to keep your protein levels down, things like that. And, you know, maybe Aaron might have a better sense of that too, even with some of the co-op trials there. And I work with primarily, not too much out of the province. We will venture out a little bit, get into Manitoba, Brandon, or, you know, Western Manitoba in particular, and not too much in Alberta. But yeah, you get into central Alberta, of course, anywhere in the black soil zone, I think, right? Dark brown, black. I don't know. That's a loaded question. I don't know if I really know the answer. I feel pretty blessed to do the work that I do at Indian Head. I know it is an area where even in the dry years, it's very rare to have a crop failure. You know, just a few timely rains and bit of a recharge over the winter can carry us a long ways. And just even our land with the good surface drainage, for the most part, we can flag our plots from corner to corner in a field without worrying about sloughs, salinity, things like that. So, but time to move on.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Chris.